Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Jelena Alston, and I am on the executive committee for the Commission of Professors of Adult Education. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to serve as a moderator for this wonderful and exciting session that we have for you. We are very thrilled to have Dr. Lisa Brown and Dr. William Darity. They are going to provide you with a wonderful presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lisa Brown, and she's going to take it from here. I do ask for everyone, please mute yourself, and please use the chat function. If you have questions, we will entertain questions at the end of their presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure we're set for high floating. Okay. Well, I'd like to begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to Commission Chair Ellen Scully Russ and the entire Public Affairs Committee, Michelle Doyle, and other fellow AAACE members for their encouragement and guidance in the production of our position paper. My words of gratitude are also extended to the AAACE board who sanctioned this publication. A special thank you to the Commission for Professors of Adult Education and the Commission for Adult Basic Education and Literacy for sponsoring our webinar today. Now, although Native Black Americans have served in every conflict in US history, including the Continental Army before she even became an independent nation, the granting of full citizenship rights for American descendants of slavery has remained elusive. We honor the memory of those enslaved antecedents whose children today are engaged in a struggle for equality, dignity, and just recompense that has eluded their forebears here in America. Our celebration of American Independence Day occurs on the 4th of July every year. We think it apropos that our claims for the debt owed to American descendants of slavery, or ADOS, begin from that significant start date of 1776. This epic represents the birth of the United States of America as an independent nation. It also points to where our government must be held accountable for the stolen labor, property, and lives under its sanctioning of a system of chattel slavery. Now, in terms of my portion of the webinar, I plan to highlight from an adult education perspective, how American descendants of slavery are owed a debt from the United States government. From the horrors and inhumanity of US chattel slavery through the American Civil War, to the Emancipation Proclamation that only freed those slaves being held in rebellious Confederate states, to the hopefulness of the Reconstruction era, where the formerly enslaved freedmen saw the introduction of the nation's first Civil Rights Act, as well as the establishment of the 13th and 14th Amendments on their behalf, to the failure of Reconstruction and the rise of the Jim Crow era, and birth of the Ku Klux Klan, wherein white mobs lynched, burned, and terrorized Black Americans and murdered many whites who supported their call for full citizenship rights. To the second wave civil rights movement led by Dr. King and others, to the contemporary ADOS movement that has used social media to resurrect the call for reparations focused on the descendant of American slaves. Native Black Americans, or ADOS, are a stolen and sold people group, not immigrants, with a recognizably distinct and cruel history in America. The 1960 United States Census gives us some framing in terms of the population of the country. If you look at the data from that census, you'll note that the United States was primarily a Black and white country. That is in large part due to the 1890 US Census that actually set immigration quotas, and those quotas favored more Northern European countries. It was through the actions of the civil rights movement, the advocacy of those persons like Dr. King and others, we introduced the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which opened up the country's borders to other races. Now, when we talk about the establishment of full citizenship rights for ADOS, I'd like to introduce a couple of conceptual terms for us to consider. When we talk about equality, it is essentially defined as treating everyone the same and giving everyone access to the same opportunities. Meanwhile, equity refers to proportional representation of things like race, class, and gender, and providing that equity in those type of opportunities. Now, when we talk about equity, it is giving everyone what they need to be successful. Equality, treating everyone the same, is framed around aims of the promotion of fairness and, in my view, restorative justice. But it can only work if parties start from the same place and receive the same help. Now, when we talk about the legacy of ADOS life, there are a number of inherited disadvantages that are quite burdensome to this community. They have included issues of adult illiteracy, academic achievement gaps for them and their children, stolen generational wealth, and denial of human dignity and premature death. Now, baby boomers born between 1944 and 1964 are currently making the largest generational wealth transfer in US history. American descendants of slavery are largely absent from that wealth transfer. And it's important to note that family lineage matters because wealth is typically passed down through families. Now, for those of you who are familiar with my scholarship, I take a spiral dynamic theory position as it relates to examining this phenomenon of reparations and the call for national reparations. And just to give you a little bit of background about this particular framework, it is a theoretical framework of psychosocial adult development. Essentially, it's a color-coded mnemonic of these evolving paradigms and worldview constructs, identifying the similarities and differences that we see in human thinking. It is a framework of hierarchical adult thinking that progresses from a very simplistic to more complex neuropsychology and problem-solving capacity. The framework has application in 3 specific domains, and it also oscillates between themes of individualism and collectivism. Spiral dynamic theory holds that a change in worldview is not inevitable for all adults. There is this potential for entrenchment of thinking, progression, and in some instances, regression along this open-ended framework. Units of culture, known as memes, can serve to influence the social justice outcomes we see in relationship to this thinking. So here I created an animation to help you fully appreciate the spiraling nature of these worldview constructs as one would progress along the framework. On the right side of the framework, you see these orientations that are more individualistic in nature. On the left side of the framework, those are more collectivist in nature. As I continue to observe the debates and arguments over reparations, I find that as a society, us centered within these 4 particular constructs. And I want to say a little bit about them. So the red colored mnemonic or worldview construct concerns itself with power impulsive. So you have, in terms of the thinking associated with this adult, ruling others through domination and force. And there's this attention to winners and losers. And of course, your efforts and goals are to be a winner. As we progress along the framework, we come to this blue mnemonic, which signals these ideas of purposeful saintliness. And so here there's attention to morals and ethicals leading your worldview and sense of right and wrong, and that there is an attention to authority as a means by which you operate and obey instruction. The next advancement would be the orange mnemonic. Now, this particular worldview is called strategic materialism, where there's attention to competition and the use of manipulation in order to win. There's a privileging of the use of technology as a means to conquer the material world. One wants to remain in power and control, but you don't want to draw the ire or negative effects associated with your ambitions. And the last one being more humanistic in nature. In this particular adult worldview, we see attention to preserving shared resources, being in balance with the ecosystems that surround you. And in terms of leadership, there's an attention more so to consensus building, and there's a decentralized of an individual single leadership style. I believe, in terms of my scholarship, that these worldviews in their various stages and conflicts can kind of signal those who would be either for or against reparation. And that's a part of my current research. So as I talk about ADOS identity, I have found it very interesting an attempts to almost erasure that identity or amalgamate it, and it being used for purposes of social capital. The biggest offender today has been, in fact, higher education. So essentially, everyone can be Black, even white people, but whiteness remains a highly selective class status. Our first example being that of Rachel Dolezal, the infamous Rachel Dolezal, who in 2015 was a professor at Eastern Washington University. And she projected and presented herself as a person who was Black, but wasn't outed by other Black people, but was in fact outed by her white parents. And so you see this kind of identity fraud going unchecked and oftentimes without penalty. So that was 2005. We most recently saw this repeated by Jessica Krug, who is a professor at George Washington University, who again, similar to Rachel Dolezal, kind of inculcated this this ADOS Black identity for purposes of social capital and gain in that particular arena, presenting herself as Black, but also enjoying what would be the benefits of her whiteness and access as a function of that. We had a white graduate student who pretended to be Black and subsequently apologized and resigned at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this has not just happened with women, it has also occurred with men. So here you have Mindy Kaling, I don't know if anybody remembers her from The Office, an Indian American woman. Well, her brother bragged to CNN about how he faked being Black in order to gain access to medical school. So this whole notion of identity fraud has even expanded in the case of a white male more recently. So you have a professor who took on this social media identity as a Black woman simply to kind of bully the women in his institution at the University of New Hampshire. But the irony being, none of these people embrace an ADOS reality because they want to experience the inherited disadvantage of an ADOS life. I would argue that none of these people would have wanted to be in the position of a Breonna Taylor or an Atiana Jefferson, who was murdered in her home by a Texas policeman on a wellness check. So when we think about one of the most heart-wrenching experiences of ADOS life, we have to look at the recent phenomena of George Floyd. And I've gotten to the point where I have really stopped watching these kind of videos and stuff because I find them too triggering. But few people know that there is a legacy of stolen wealth associated with George Floyd's family. The Washington Post did a story showing that during Reconstruction, his great-great-grandfather was amassed 500 acres of land. But because of issues with them being illiterate, he and his wife, they were swindled out of that land and out of that generational wealth opportunity to transfer to George and his subsequent children, which is really interesting when you think about it because they didn't have the capacity to read and write. It was illegal in North Carolina at that time to learn how to read and write. So one can only imagine what could be the result of a George Floyd life had he had that wealth transfer. Would we never have seen a policeman's knee mercilessly taking and expunging out his life, being an American descendant of slavery? But not only is there profit being made in what I have come to term as death culture of ADOS people, we see here an example that I saw on Twitter that I found quite stunning was these two women in the UK who, as a result of George Floyd's life, took an opportunity to raise almost $500,000 to target what they called some Black people in the UK's need for therapy. None of those resources were going to George Floyd's family or to his, in fact, direct descendants. So when we talk about for-profit exploitation of ADOS life, we have to remember the unique experiences of this group. And so what I'd like to do is share a little short video clip about medical torture that was the explicit purview of slave women.
At the edge of Central Park in Manhattan, there's a bronze statue of a doctor named James Marion Sims, whose brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world. He's the guy who created the vaginal speculum, an instrument gynecologists use for examination. He pioneered the surgical repair for fistula, a complication from childbirth, and became known as the father of modern gynecology. But that brilliant achievement was the result of a series of excruciating experimental surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
That's Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author who chronicled the intersection of race and medicine in her book, Medical Apartheid. While many of the stark racial disparities in healthcare can be attributed to environmental and economic factors like access to good healthcare, studies show that minority patients tend to receive a lower quality of care than non-minorities, even when they have the same types of health insurance or the same ability to pay for care.
As African Americans who've been abused for so long, consistently by the system, why should we trust it? Why should we go to when ill? And that's iatrophobia. That's a fear of the healer, inculcated by the behavior of those healers, unfortunately.
It starts with slavery. Doctors relied on slave owners for financial stability. They accompanied plantation masters to auctions to verify the fitness of slaves and were called in to treat sick slaves to protect their owners' investments. In 1807, Congress abolished the importation of slaves and in turn pushed Black women to have more children, to essentially breed slaves. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson later wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm." Around the 1830s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, or efforts to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there were polygenists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolved from different origins. The 1830s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. One doctor performed experimental C-sections on slaves. Another one perfected the dangerous ovariotomy, or removal of an ovary by testing the procedure on slave women. In fact, half the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments on Black people. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves.
So that brings me to some outcomes that we are seeing in terms of ethnic and racial disparities with the coronavirus. And so this was the table that I got directly off of the CDC website that I found interesting and wanted to deconstruct a little bit. So it talks about the COVID-19 hospitalizations by race and ethnicity. And here you see them associate the risk markers for other underlying conditions that are impacting the outcomes in relationship to infection. And they go on to include socioeconomic status, access to healthcare, and increased exposure to the virus by way of occupation. What's interesting that around the nation, in local health departments and even state departments, they have overtly and explicitly declared, many of them, anti-Blackness and racism as an actual public health issue. We have not reached that stage, to my understanding, on the federal level. Nevertheless, in looking at these outcomes, juxtaposition white persons cases, we see here among American Indians, Blacks, and Latinos, a pretty similar infection rate. In terms of hospitalization, the number is actually slightly higher among Native Americans, a group that has historically struggled with challenges of disease and poor health. But what's ironic is that when we look at the death rate, even though pretty similar for the other non-white groups, the death rate of Black Americans is twice as high. This is something worthy of investigation and a part of what my personal call is for the disaggregation of ethnic identity as it relates to ADOS people. So who are the rightful claimants for reparation in the United States? Who are the rightful claimants owed a debt from the United States government? My argument is that it is ADOS people. And so I talked earlier how I wanted to revisit these concepts of equality and equity. And I like to do that in connection to the American descendants of slavery. So when we talk about equality for ADOS, it requires reparations, and that a reparation that rectifies the Black-white racial wealth gap in America. Reparations are essentially the precondition to any sustainable 21st century equity project on behalf of this unique group. Now, what can we do as professors, adult educators, and community engaged leaders as it relates to acting as reparationists who provide institutional models for social justice? And I use that term reparationist that I borrowed from a group of online young men who I have dubbed community scholars, and I'll talk a little bit more about that next. But they use reparationist as a modern term in association to what we had in the past as abolitionists who fought against slavery in the country. But as those persons engaged in education and learning, what we can do is expand our civic engagement capacity. And we can do that through our teaching, the types of research and more in-depth research based upon disaggregated data, creating situations where we can have service learning opportunities for our students, and then coming together to build local and national coalitions based upon this database of information we create on behalf of reparations for American descendants of slavery. So you might ask, Lisa, how in the world do we do and serve civic engagement and the reparation cause during a pandemic? And my answer to you would be through online civic and community engagement. So here we have a Pew Research study, which is really interesting because it was before COVID-19 broke out. But they found in this study that US adult use of social media that included Facebook was mostly unchanged between 2018 and 2019. So you see, according to the chart, that YouTube and Facebook have been the most used means by which to engage in online education. And so when you look at the age group, we typically, as adult educators, use the age 25 and up. You see that YouTube is a significant means by which we might potentially engage in pandemic era adult education. So one of the things I did along with Dr. Darity and his co-author, Krista Mullins, and also Steve Cannon, who's also in the chat today, is that we took Dr. Darity's seminal work from Here to Equality and his book and decided to do some open source free adult learning online during the pandemic. So we created this ADOS reparationist guide where we reach out to people who are engaged in this online reparationist activity and ask those adults to contribute to these kind of frequently asked questions and responses using this book to ground us. And so we produced our first issue of the volume. We plan for it to be quarterly. And I think Jelena is going to drop the link in there to you all to an article in Moguldom who talked about our reparationist guide. So we have 4 authors in each edition. I covered the area of education and civic engagement, while Steve, Sandy, and his wife, Kirsten, cover other areas. And so we're really excited about that. So this group that's going to be our next group of authors are the young men who introduced me to the reparationist term, and they have a YouTube channel called Be the Power. And I would just love to have these guys in my class because they are so scholarly and just are amazing researchers. And they've already agreed to participate in the next volume. So we're really excited about that. In any event, I'm going to close my proposal of my webinar and talk about some proposals for ADOS equality and inclusion that we can engage in as reparationists and those engaged in adult education and learning. One of the things we can do is advocate for pure reparations based upon the cumulative intergenerational effects of slavery and the failure to provide the formerly enslaved the promised 40 acres of land upon emancipation. We can advocate for the disaggregation of race and ethnic data so that we can accurately capture the true socioeconomic condition of this group ADOS. Another thing we could do is advocate for federal race and ethnic classification with protected class. So we don't see these instances where people take on identities of being Black simply for purposes of exploitation. We can advocate that community colleges and post-secondary training programs be awarded federal funding and contracts to develop ADOS targeted adult literacy and basic education projects for purposes of workforce development and re-entry. We can also advocate that citizens vote for representatives who support a strong racial justice campaign that centers Native Black Americans as its cause. We can advocate for access to federal student financial aid and restoration of voting rights to the formerly incarcerated who are engaged in redemptive educational pursuits, and then offering those supports so they can have destigmatized futures as a result of that support. Advocate for the abolition of ethnic microaggressions and the social indignities targeted at the American descendants of slavery, where false criminal claims are lobbied by people who intend to bring harm and physical hurt to Black Americans by police. And we can advocate for the psychological undoing of negative implicit bias against ADOS people, as evidenced in subjugated and disrespectful imagery of Black Americans and their history. And also make sure that this is taking place and responded to in mass media and academic curriculum. So as a national reparationist, one would have to be involved in advocacy for ADOS by petitioning the Congress, because constitutionally, the United States Congress is the group who sets reparations spending priorities and appropriation bill. Congress controls the purse. So national public good campaigns can be engaged with as reparationists and advocates for reparation for ADOS, which means facilitating American justice and adult education for ADOS citizens, leading to restorative justice as workforce readiness and fair participation in economic enterprise in the country. So I really am going to come to the end of my conclusion. I did like the preacher's sermon ending, but this really is the last thing I wanted to share with you all. And I wonder how many people will recognize this quote. So this quote is made famous by someone, and some of you may know who it is. I'm just curious, some of you who don't. But in this quote, the person indicated that those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. And there will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his or her full citizenship right. That was said by leading reparationist Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the I Have a Dream speech in 1964. So Dr. King was a staunch advocate of reparation for the American descendants of slavery. And so here are my bibliography and references. I invite you to, use those resources as you will. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. And so I will turn it back over to our host and stop sharing my screen. Jelena, are you there? Okay.
Yes, I just assumed that Dr. Darity was going to go ahead and just start right after you. So once he gets everything set up, he can take it from there.
Okay. I'm going to mute my button.
Okay. Slideshow. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Brown, for what was really a very powerful presentation. And I appreciated your advocacy of specific steps that people can take to move forward in terms of increased racial equity in the United States and adoption of a reparations project for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I'd like to open my remarks with a quotation from Malcolm X, which is a useful frame for what is going to follow in the comments that I'm going to provide. The critical thing here is Malcolm X's distinction between pulling a knife out of somebody's back versus healing the wound. And I would like people to think about the notion of pulling the knife out as a matter of ending the harms and damages that have been taking place. That is the harm of the knife being plunged into someone's back, ending that. But that healing the wound is a matter of providing compensation for the effects of that harm, for the effects of that blow. And so on the one hand, ending the harm is something that's essential. But on the other hand, healing the wound is also essential. And it's the latter that constitutes reparations, the actual act of compensation for the harm. And so that leads directly to the definition of reparations that we advance in the pages of From Here to Equality, Kirsten Mullen and I. So reparations is a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. Acknowledgement involves the admission on the part of the culpable party that they have committed a grievous harm. And this admission should include an enumeration of the damages inflicted upon the victims and advantages appropriated by the culpable party, as well as a commitment to engage in restitution. So the second stage in reparations is redress, which is in fact the act of restitution, or what I referred to a moment ago as the healing of the wound. Historically, redress has taken the form typically of direct payments to the community of individuals who have been subjected to the grievous injustice. Examples of this include the payments by the German government of reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, and in the United States context, the payments of the United States government to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. In both of those instances, direct payments were made to the direct victims, as well as in some instances to their heirs and descendants. This also leads in turn to the third dimension of reparations, which is closure. And this is an agreement on the part of the culpable party and the victimized community that the account has been settled, that the debt has been paid, that redress, the act of redress, is sufficient for the books to be closed. Now, the books can be reopened in the event of a new wave of atrocities and or a new set or type of atrocities taking place. But otherwise, the victimized community will make no further claims on the culpable party. I have jumped too far. Give me a moment. I'll try to get back to where I should be. Okay. So I want to talk about three dimensions of a reparations plan specifically for Black American descendants of US slavery. And the first involves establishing eligibility for the reparations plan. This constitutes two criteria for eligibility. The first is what we refer to as a lineage standard. An individual would have to demonstrate that they have one ancestor, at least one ancestor, who was enslaved in the United States. The second is what we refer to as an identity standard. And an identity standard involves self-identification. That is to say, an individual would have to indicate that they have self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American on an official document for at least 12 years prior to the enactment of a reparations plan or a enactment of legislation for a study commission for reparations. Both of these criteria have to be met for a reparations project to be meaningful. We also want to emphasize that eligibility is linked to the community that has borne and continues to bear the undue burden of the cumulative effects of three phases of atrocities or injustices in the nation's trajectory of white supremacy. So we want to start, of course, with chattel slavery, which is the crucible that produced white supremacy in the United States. But we want to also acknowledge that chattel slavery in and of itself is not the only motivation for introducing a reparations plan in the United States, that we also have to take into account the Jim Crow era, the nearly century-long period of legal segregation or apartheid in the United States. And this is a period that I'm going to talk about some of the accompanying acts that are associated with creating the harms that we now observe being manifest. And then the third phase are the atrocities that have continued even in the aftermath of the passage of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. And these include mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Black people, sustained credit, housing, and employment discrimination, and the immense Black-white wealth disparity. Let me start by talking about what the magnitude of that wealth disparity is. When we are looking at inequality in wealth by race in the United States, we have to recognize that approximately 13% of the nation's population consists of Black American descendants of US slavery. But that is a community that only possesses about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. This translates into a condition in which there is a net worth differential between the average Black and white household of approximately $800,000. And we will come back to that. The cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy are a consequence of a number of policies, both actions and inactions, maintained by the federal government that have created this huge disparity in wealth between whites and Blacks. The first of these involves the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when the formerly enslaved were promised 40-acre land grants as restitution for their years of bondage. and this promise was not fulfilled. But at the same time, the federal government was in the process of providing 160-acre land grants to upwards of 1.5 million white families in the United States under the auspices of the Homestead Act. These were land grants that were made on the western territories of the nation, territories that had been appropriated from the native population. And this process of engaging in homesteading was the completion of a settler colonial project on this nation. We'll note further that there is evidence that has emerged in recent studies by scholars like Trina Shank Williams that at least 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of the land grants that were delivered to their ancestors. And so as a consequence, the foundation for the racial wealth gap can be found in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, with the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with anything, while significant numbers of white Americans were in receipt of land grants in the western part of the United States. This initial situation was compounded by the fact that when Black Americans did manage to accumulate land and other types of property, and in instances where they were able to actually acquire a certain degree of prosperity, frequently that was literally destroyed. And it was destroyed in a series of massacres that took place in the United States from the end of the Civil War into the 1940s. These massacres, occurring both north and south, involved the major destruction of Black property, or in many instances, the appropriation of that property by the white terrorists, as well as, of course, substantial loss in Black lives. I think one of the instances that is most familiar to many Americans now, and I think it's only become familiar fairly recently, is the 1921 massacre that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But in the year 1919, there were upwards of 30 of these events that took place nationwide, both north and south, that resulted in substantial loss of lives, as well as substantial destruction of Black property, or removal of Black property from Black hands and its transfer into white hands. This occurred in cities ranging from Chicago, Illinois, to Omaha, Nebraska, to Washington, D.C., to Ocoee, Florida, and to Elaine, Arkansas. In the 20th century, there was a transition from an emphasis on accumulation of wealth via land acquisition to a focus on acquisition of homes, or home ownership, as a prelude to gaining, to building wealth. And in fact, the home ownership focus, which was emphasized in two pieces of legislation, the New Deal legislation as well as the GI Bill, was the mechanism that produced the greatest degree of upward social mobility for the most significant number of Americans since the Homestead Acts themselves. And so we had a situation in which the process of home ownership on racial grounds is skewed or tilted by restrictive covenants. Then it's skewed and tilted by redlining and predatory lending and housing markets, and then it's skewed and tilted further by the discriminatory application of the New Deal legislation as well as the GI Bill, in such a way that there was a disproportionate benefit for whites and a significant denial of the opportunity to access those benefits of subsidies for home ownership on the part of Blacks. So we have an enormous racial wealth gap, and we have an explanation for it, which has to do with the inability of one social group to transfer significant resources to their sons and daughters, while another social group has a strong capacity to transfer resources to their sons and daughters. And that difference in capability is a consequence of social policy in the United States. So I now want to focus on the second dimension of a reparations project, which is the matter of how much should be paid. How much should be paid? And I want to begin by looking at the mean wealth statistics in the United States from the interval of 1989 into 2016. I want to demonstrate that these net worth statistics, this is net worth by household, there's been a significant widening of the gap in wealth between Black and white households, even since 1989. So we're really talking about largely a 30-year interval. And I think that that's quite effectively displayed in this visual chart. Excuse me. I mentioned a moment ago that the origins of the racial wealth gap start with the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre grants of land that were promised in the aftermath of the Civil War. In this chart, we try to calculate how much 40 million acres would be worth in the present moment in the United States. And if you look at the far right column, I want you to recognize that each of those figures needs to be multiplied by $10 million. So that what we have displayed here is an approximate valuation based upon, I think, a 4% interest rate over the period between 1915 and 2020 of a total value of the equivalent of 40 acres having been allocated to 4 million formerly enslaved persons in the United States in 10-acre allotments per person. This would amount to about $3.1 trillion. And that's what's reflected in this diagram. We could use a higher interest rate. We could use the actual rate of return, average rate of return that has been earned in the stock market during the period from 1880 to the present moment, which is actually slightly in excess of 9%. And if we were to use that rate of interest for compounding to the present, then we would get a figure that's closer to $9 trillion. In this diagram, we try to plot a set of estimates for reparations projects using a variety of methods. Some of these methods involve the attempt to try to cost out how much the damages of slavery, meant to the individuals who were subjected to enslavement. Others of these involve the present value calculation of the 40 acres that they were denied. There is a calculation here that's indicated on the far right from the work that Kirsten Mullen and I have done, in which we use the racial wealth differential that exists in the present moment as the basis for estimating how much the reparations bill should be. And this is our preferred procedure. It would lead to an estimate in the vicinity of $10 to $12 trillion. But what you can see from this diagram is that the average estimate across all of these approaches to calculating reparations is about $9 trillion, which is essentially in the same ballpark of the estimate that we offer in our own book that's based upon the racial wealth differential. Here we have a diagram that gives us information about differences in wealth at the median. Now, what do we mean here? We mean differences in household wealth that's based upon households that are at the middle of the respective distributions among whites and blacks. So the far right diagram is one that indicates what the differential is between non-Hispanic whites and Hispanics in the United States. And we can see that that's a gap that's in the vicinity of about $150,000. It's not very different from the gap that we observe for Black Americans in the left column. That's somewhat similar. It's about $153,000. But this is a gap at the center of the distribution that involves the middle households. We argue in From Here to Equality that the differential that I showed you in the previous slide that is based upon the mean instead of the median is more relevant for the purposes of calculating the reparations bill. If you intend to eliminate the difference in wealth between blacks and whites in terms of shares of wealth that are consistent with shares in the population, you need to use the mean rather than the median, because the use of the median will not erase the entire racial wealth gap. Let me give you two illustrative points here. The first is, and this is a somewhat staggering statistic, but 97% of the wealth that is held by white households in the United States is in the possession of households that have a net worth in excess of the white median of $171,000, which means that half of all white households possess 97% of white wealth. This means that if we tried to target the median for the purposes of eliminating the racial wealth gap, we don't eliminate it. We only moderate it slightly. Instead, we have to focus on that $800,000 differential that's associated with the mean gap. And if we do that, we take into account that upper half of the wealth distribution. And it's significant that we do that because there's a second statistic that I'd like to give you as an indicator of why it's important to go that route. The second statistic is the following. 25% of white households have a net worth in excess of $1 million. It's only 4% of black households in the United States. And so that's extremely compelling from the standpoint of establishing that this enormous wealth differential at the mean is not simply a consequence of there being a small handful of white billionaires, although there is a small handful of white billionaires, but it's also because there's a heavy weight to the distribution of wealth that goes to a significant portion of the white population, those individuals who have a net worth above the white median. This leads in turn to another diagram that I want to share with you that captures how wealth differentials change over the course of the life cycle as people age. And I think that this is a fairly dramatic demonstration that from the point at which people are in their 30s onwards towards the years of age that are consistent with the one that the phase in life that I'm in, that there's a significant widening of the differential between black and white wealth. The left diagram provides you with an image of how the differential widens at the median. The right diagram demonstrates how the differential widens at the mean. And you can see that in both diagrams, there is a much wider differential that exists in the oldest years in comparison with the youngest years that are displayed in the diagram. So the third dimension of the reparations project is a commitment that we make to the idea that the primary way in which the funds from a reparations plan, and those are funds that would eliminate the racial wealth gap, the primary way in which funds should be disbursed is through direct payments to eligible recipients. In this particular diagram, we look at changes in attitudes towards the payment of cash to Black Americans for the purposes of meeting a reparations bill. And what's particularly striking is how that support has changed over the course of about 20 years, and it's changed substantially. At the beginning of the current century, a study by Ravana Popoff and Michael Dawson at the University of Chicago found that only 4% of white Americans were in favor of any form of cash payments to Black Americans who were descendants of slaves. That figure was increased substantially by June 2019 to somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 20%, depending upon which exact study you looked at. What is striking and what we don't have an opportunity to display on this particular diagram is that by June 2020, there was a study that was conducted by Civics that indicated that about 39% of white Americans and a majority of all Americans were in favor of cash payments to Black Americans who were descendants of slaves. This is a striking change, and it does suggest that we are in a precious moment to push forward on the cause of reparations. But the key point here is payments should be made to Black Americans who are descendants of slaves. And although this diagram refers to cash payments as the standard questions that were asked to survey respondents did, we're actually somewhat open-minded about whether it should be cash payments or payments that are made in other forms or some combination. The other forms might include trust accounts or endowments of some type. And who should pay? Well, it's the federal government, and it's because the federal government is the culpable party. It created the legal and authority framework that led to the array of atrocities that we've talked about in all three phases of American history. And so as a consequence, Black reparations are not a matter of personal or individual institutional guilt. They are a matter of national responsibility. That national responsibility has to be borne by the federal government. This means in turn that piecemeal efforts at reparations are not sufficient. And what we mean by piecemeal efforts are local, individual efforts that are made that fall under the banner of reparations. And the reason why we think that this is not suitable is because, first of all, many of these steps that are taken at the local or municipal level or even at the state level are more a matter of pulling the knife out rather than healing the wound. They're more a matter of reversing or ending a set of harms that have been taking place for a long span of time versus actually compensating for the damages that have been incurred. But even if they were attempts at compensation, there's not an adequate scale of resources at the local or state level to meet the bill. The total budgets for all US state and local governments combined is approximately $3.1 trillion. $3.1 trillion falls far short of the bill that we have advanced of $10 to $12 trillion. So it's not merely a question of the federal government being the culpable party. It is the federal government that has the capacity to meet the bill, while states and municipalities do not. Finally, to the extent that there's no coordination of these efforts and they're occurring sporadically, they will not be systemic. They will be incremental efforts that won't fundamentally change the conditions of structural racism in the United States. And so we conclude here by saying, though piecemeal initiatives are admirable in their recognition of the existence of a debt, these incremental efforts will not fundamentally change the conditions of structural, racial, economic inequality. What will change those conditions? A program of reparations, a plan of reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery.
If you all would please join me in a round of applause for our wonderful presenters, Dr. Lisa Brown and Dr. William Darity. If you can use your reactions or clap. We greatly appreciate your enthusiasm, your energy, and the wealth of information. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So at this time, we will open it up for a Q&A session. Again, you can use the chat as well as go ahead and unmute yourself.
I don't hear anyone talking. Was anyone talking?
Any questions or comments? Is everyone just processing it all? Is that what it is? Well, while they're waiting and you know, the thoughts are stirring, Dr. Brown or Dr. Darity, is there anything else you want to add, or any questions do you have of the attendees?
I don't have any additional questions. I know I spent a long time. I hope people really enjoyed the presentation. And we are open to any kind of questions that people might want to ask more privately. I think our email addresses should be made available to you by way of the AAACE website. And I'm really looking forward to our upcoming conference. And shout out to any of my colleagues from Columbus State Community College that joined today. I really appreciate that if you were able to come in. I know a number of people said they had planned to attend.
So Lisa, hi, Dr. Brown. Hi, Dr. Darity. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you.
This is Ellen Scully Russ. Good to see you. I do have a question. You did acknowledge that there are a number of different sort of piecemeal state and local initiatives. And of course, there is consideration of national legislation. What's your best recommendation or insight into where we are in sort of a national push towards a national reparations strategy? What do you see as sort of the promising signs and the challenges related to that you know, everyday folks might be able to get behind and do something about to support?
Well, personally, I would love to see everyone form and activate a coalition that would promote reparations, a comprehensive program of reparations at the national level. So what would be involved, I presume, would be lobbying and petitioning Congress for such a program. And I think that that would be terrific if people would join in that effort. But you know, when Kirsten and I have been asked this question in the past about what should people do, that's the first thing that we mention. But the second thing we say is that we are all members of a variety of organizations and groups. And many of these organizations and groups have a significant impact on people's lives in a more local arena. And that we should make sure that those organizations and groups are in order or have their own house in order also. Because so many of the organizations that we're linked to or belong to are actually have had a long history of discriminatory practices of their own. I mean, I'm in a university that has a long history of exclusion of Black scholars. There are very few of us at the institution, and there are some departments that have never had a Black faculty member at all. And so I think it's vital that's a step that's taken in terms of reversing that pattern, pulling the knife out, if you will. But from the standpoint of healing the wound, I think that these institutions should coalesce and become major advocates for reparations at the national level.
Mm-hmm. And I concur with Dr. Darity's comments. And in terms of my scholarship, I'm really excited about civic and community engagement and seeing people feeling a sense of investment in this reparations project and advocacy has been very exciting for me. I think oftentimes people get intimidated by the town-gown relationship, and that the pandemic has afforded us an opportunity to form these kind of virtual advocacy groups. And so I'm really excited about that. And I'd like to see that go forward as a part of our role as, you know, professors and educators and those persons who work in community advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Yes, I have a comment and a question. I really, but the comment is I do very much appreciate and very much enjoyed the the presentation and the insight provided. It's very thoughtful, very reflective, and quite powerful, in fact. You make a strong case for reparations, and your voice should be heard and amplified in various dimensions. As I think about this, and I'm of that age and from the part of the country where I did experience Jim Crow, separate but equal doctrine, and grew up around during the period of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And you have to choose either one or the others. You were grown up in that period. At any rate, being in the inner city, being in a large city now, and looking at urban education and urban programs, and looking at how our kids, the pipeline for universities and for society, how those kids are treated and how poor the school systems are, and looking at these Black communities where crime is escalated and safety is a huge concern. And you have, I remember Julius Wilson's work about when he started studying urban decay in Chicago and how it spread. Well, those are people in those communities, and many of them would be eligible for this type of payment. And so when you talk about healing the wound, it seems to me that some thought ought to be given to how if the day ever comes where this country will do the right thing and provide these payments, how do you provide payments in such a way that the payments help to heal the wound, as opposed to making people targets for exploitation of a system that's already in place to exploit them? When you have financial literacy issues, you have psychological issues from the oppression that's already in place. So how do you make a proposal in such a way that it becomes very clear that people will heal from this, as opposed to being victimized more?
So in the period in the aftermath of the Civil War, when the 40 acres supposedly was going to be provided to the formerly enslaved, there was a companion issue, which was the question of whether or not, if the land allocations were made, their possession would be protected. And had the land allocations been made and had steps been taken to protect their possession of the land, it would have been essential for the Union Army to have remained in the South, and it would have been essential for the Union Army to begin a process of actually arming the formerly enslaved themselves to aid in their own defense. So the question of protection of the recipients of reparations was a question that was there at the very beginning. And so in the pages of From Here to Equality, we suggest that that although financial literacy is something that is fairly useless if you have no finances to manage, that's virtually the equivalent of giving somebody a menu without them having any food. Once you're in a situation in which these types of allocations have actually been made, these allotments of reparations payments have actually been made, then it might be reasonable to think about actually having a financial literacy program that's made available to the recipients. And we talk about that in From Here to Equality as a potential option. And we include in that education about prospects for being subjected to fraud, which would be a critical issue in a situation like this. And so there needs to be ways in which people are protected from the effort to appropriate their property, not just physical methods of appropriating their property, but also methods that are fraudulent as a way appropriating their resources. And so I think we're somewhat aware of this as an issue, and we think that steps need to be taken to insulate the recipients of the reparations payments from those kinds of difficulties.
Any other questions or comments? Dr. Alfred, are you there? Did you have a question or a comment? Dr. Alfred, we can't hear you if you're speaking. You may have to use the chat. If you type it in, I will absolutely repeat your question for you.
I believe she was having a few computer problems.
Yeah.
She said it was a long question, so.
Oh.
As she served on my dissertation committee, I'm not surprised about her long questions, and I appreciate her long questions. Dr. Brown and Dr. Darity, if you could you share your email addresses in the chat? That way, if someone would like to connect with you later, if they have questions or to explore the possibility of future collaborations or want to join your efforts, that way they have your contact information here. In addition to, I believe it was included in the email that was sent out through the AAACE.
I just put mine in the chat.
All right, there you have it.
Dr. Darity, could you retype yours? Because I don't.
Oh, I didn't.
Got it. All right, I see it now. Well, thank you everyone again for joining. Be on the lookout for up and coming future webinars that are sponsored by CPAE. And I hope that everyone continues to be well, stay safe. And I know we all look forward to next week because we have our conference, our virtual conference. So everyone have a great afternoon and take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.